When you've been a crime scene investigator for almost 2 decades, you start to believe you've seen everything. But sometimes, just sometimes, the scene challenges everything you think you know. I remember that case vividly, not because of the brutality of the crime, but because of one absurd, impossible detail, a footprint on the ceiling. It was a cold morning when I got the call. An abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a body discovered by a group of teenagers who broke in seeking thrills. I could already anticipate the mess before I even arrived. But what I found went beyond any mess I'd ever seen. The victim was a man in his early 40s, sprawled in the center of the living room. From the initial look, blunt force trauma to the head. Most likely instant death. Furniture was scattered, drawers pulled out, items smashed and ground. At first glance, it looked like a violent robbery, but there was something off. Something staged. As I began my sweep of the scene, I moved carefully, analyzing angles, blood spatter, broken objects. Then, as I tilted my head back to check for possible entry points through the ceiling beams, I froze. There, printed clearly in the thin layer of dust on the cracked ceiling, was a footprint. A single, unmistakable shoe print. Size 10 by the look of it. Upside down. My heart raced. I blinked several times to make sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But no, it was there. Real. Perfectly imprinted. I called the team over. Cameras flashed. Evidence markers placed. The rookie officer next to me whispered, "How? How is that even possible?" Good question. My mind raced through possibilities. Someone could have climbed up and planted it. But there were no ladders, no chairs stacked, no obvious climbing aids. The house had been abandoned for years. The dust was undisturbed everywhere, except for that single print. If someone had recently set it up, there would have been clear signs of movement, handprints, something, but there was nothing. The only fingerprints we found in the house belonged to the victim. No signs of forced entry. No foreign DNA under his nails. Nothing to point to a struggle with someone else. And yet, the footprint mocked us from above, as if laughing at our confusion. Hours turned into days. We went through the victim's history, searching for anything unusual. Turns out, the man was an amateur stuntman, specialized in acrobatics and parkour. That explained his flexibility. But it didn't explain how his killer, or whoever, managed to leave such a bizarre clue. It wasn't until I inspected the room one final time, late one evening, that something clicked. The ceiling wasn't a normal ceiling. On a hunch, I grabbed a flashlight and shined it at shallow angle across the surface. And there it was, fine cracks outlining a trapdoor camouflaged with paint and dust. Almost invisible to the naked eye unless you knew exactly where to look. It wasn't a ceiling. It was an old attic door. I pushed a pole through the weak panel. Dust rained down. The panel gave way, revealing a small, hidden crawl space above the room. And inside, another scene entirely. Scattered fast food wrappers, empty water bottles, and an old gym mat. Evidence that someone had been living up there. Squatter, maybe, or maybe someone more dangerous. On the mat, footprints matching the ceiling mark were everywhere. Someone had jumped, dropped down, or used a flimsy door to plant the perfect, baffling print before retreating back into hiding. But why? Why go through so much effort? Then I saw it, tucked into a crevice, a small camera still recording. The real crime wasn't robbery. It wasn't even random murder. It was a targeted kill, meticulously planned. The camera had captured the entire sequence. The victim arguing with second man in the attack, and after the death, the staging of the scene. The squatter wasn't a random drifter. He was a hired killer. He used his athleticism to create an impossible scenario, betting that our focus on the absurd would blind us to the real evidence hidden in plain sight. And it almost worked. We tracked him down using forensic analysis from the food wrappers, DNA on a straw that led to a name already flagged in a different unsolved case. When we arrested him, he just smiled and said, "I always wonder who would spot the footprint first." Some cases challenge your experience. Some challenge your logic. But this case, this footprint on the ceiling, challenged the very laws of reality. And it taught me one thing I carry to this day. Never trust the obvious. Always trust the dust. When you spend nearly 2 decades walking through crime scenes, you learn to trust your instincts. And that day, the moment I crossed the threshold of that house, my gut screamed that something was wrong. It was a wealthy neighborhood, the kind with manicured lawns and quiet streets. The victim, Mr. Arthur Bennett, was a retired banker known for being obsessively private. His house was exactly what you'd expect. Grand, spotless, every item in its place. But there was one thing that immediately caught my attention, a large, antique safe in his study. It was a magnificent piece, heavy iron with ornate gold trimming. And more importantly, it was completely intact. No scratches, no signs of forced entry. Yet, according to the preliminary report, the robbery was supposed to be the motive for the murder. I moved closer, kneeling to examine it. Dust had settled uniformly around the room, on the bookshelves, on the floorboards, but around the safe's doorframe, there was a subtle disturbance. Someone had wiped it clean recently. Odd. The body had been found 2 days earlier. Sprawled out near the staircase, a clean bullet hole to the chest. No defensive wounds. No sign of a struggle. Whoever had done it had come prepared. The police believed it was a robbery gone wrong. Jewelry boxes were open, drawers were ransacked, but oddly enough, very little seemed actually missing. Mrs. Bennett, Arthur's widow, tearfully told us that the safe contained some valuable documents and a small fortune in cash, or at least it had. But something gnawed at me. If this was a robbery, why not force the safe open? Why spend time searching through drawers and jewelry boxes, but leave the biggest prize untouched? I requested the safe to be opened properly with Mrs. Bennett's permission. When the locksmith cracked it open, we all leaned in and found it packed with cash, bonds, and documents untouched, exactly as Mrs. Bennett had described. It made no sense. That's when I started asking different questions. Not about what had been taken, but about what had been hidden. What if the safe was never the target? What if the staged robbery was a cover for something else? We reviewed the security footage. Nothing. The system had conveniently failed 2 nights before. But neighbors mentioned seeing a black car parked on the street for hours that evening. A car that belonged to one of Mr. Bennett's former business partners, Richard Lowell. Digging deeper, we discovered that Bennett and Lowell had fallen out years earlier over a failed investment scheme. Bennett had kept evidence, damning evidence, locked away. And where would a man like Bennett hide something critical? Probably not in a safe that screamed, "Steal me." So, I returned to the house with fresh eyes. I searched for hours. Finally, in the back of a built-in cabinet in the study, behind a false panel, I found it, a slim metal box filled with documents. Bank statements, fake account records, correspondence that tied Lowell directly to financial crimes worth millions. The so-called robbery had been a smokescreen. Lowell hadn't cared about valuables. He wanted the evidence destroyed, but he hadn't found the hidden box. He had staged a clumsy break-in, hoping it would distract from the real motive. When confronted with the documents, Lowell broke faster than I expected. He admitted everything. He had come to the house under the pretext of reconciliation, but when Bennett refused to cooperate, he pulled the trigger in his haste. He had failed to find what he was truly after. The safe, the glorious, imposing safe, had been a decoy all along. Its untouched contents were the silent testimony that the real treasure was elsewhere. In the end, it wasn't the bullet, the staged chaos, or even the fingerprints that solved the case. It was a simple, haunting truth that sometimes the most obvious prize is not the real one, and that real secrets are never kept where everyone can see. It's something I've carried with me ever since. Trust the dust. Trust the small things. They always know the truth before anyone else does. There are moments when everything hinges on a single, seemingly insignificant detail. That night, for me, it was a traffic light. It was a Wednesday, around 10:30 p.m. The city streets were almost deserted, save for the occasional car. I had just been called to a crime scene, a mugging gone wrong, they said. When I arrived at the location, an alley behind a convenience store, I immediately sensed that something was off. The victim, a man in his mid-30s, lay on the ground with a fatal stab wound to his chest. His wallet and phone were missing. At first glance, it screamed robbery. Simple, random, senseless. But after nearly 2 decades in forensic investigations, I knew better. Nothing is ever as it seems. The first clue was the body posture. The victim had a defensive wound on his left hand, but none on his right. Yet he was right-handed, as confirmed later by his family. That suggested he was taken by surprise, maybe even knew the attacker and didn't initially feel threatened. I examined the alley carefully. No signs of a struggle beyond a single scuff mark near the body, and oddly, no footprints leading in or out, despite the alley's soft dirt surface. Someone was being careful. Too careful for a random mugger. The convenience store security camera faced the front, not the alley. But luckily, the city had traffic cameras on a nearby street, including one right by a major intersection, a mere 50 meters from the alley's entrance. We pulled the footage. At first, the footage seemed useless. Normal traffic. A few cars passing by, no one suspicious entering or leaving the alley during the estimated time of the crime. I almost dismissed it, until I noticed something subtle. At exactly 10:24 p.m., the traffic light at the corner malfunctioned. It switched to green in just 10 seconds instead of the usual minute-long cycle. A silver sedan, which had been waiting at the red light, suddenly took off. What was odd, that car had been idle with its headlights off for nearly 5 minutes before the light changed. Parked at the crosswalk, like it was waiting for something, not someone. And then, as soon as the light shifted, the car sped away at an unusual angle, almost brushing the curb. I asked for a zoom enhancement. When the text pulled the plate number, my instincts buzzed. It was registered to a woman named Lisa Hayworth, the ex-girlfriend of the victim. A deeper dive revealed more. Their breakup hadn't been amicable. Financial disputes, accusations of cheating, even a restraining order that the victim had filed, but dropped just weeks earlier when we brought Lisa in for questioning. She denied everything, said she hadn't seen him in months, claimed her car had been stolen earlier that night, but hadn't reported it yet because, according to her, she had been too busy with friends. Her alibi was flimsy, but still not enough to charge her. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I ordered a sweep of traffic lights in the area and learned something fascinating. That particular light had manual override access nearby for city maintenance work scheduled for the next day. It was a vulnerable point. I visited the intersection in person. Sure enough, I found tampering marks near the service panel. Someone had forced it open with a slim gym tool and manually altered the cycle. This suggested planning, premeditation. Someone wanted to control the traffic flow to ensure a quick escape without witnesses. Back at the lab, we processed the service panel. Underneath the scratched metal cover, embedded deep in the edge, was a partial fingerprint. It was smudged, but enough to get a match. Lisa, confronted with the evidence. Lisa finally cracked, but her story took a turn none of us expected. She admitted to being there, but claimed she didn't kill him. She said she waited nearby to talk things through, hoping to catch him alone. When he never showed up, she panicked after seeing another figure enter the alley, a tall man she couldn't recognize in the dark, and then fled. Her testimony matched another critical piece we had overlooked. A second partial shoe print found near the alley's dumpster, far from the body. That didn't match Lisa or the victim. It belonged to a man named Greg Fulton, a known associate of the victim. Someone had been arguing with over a failed business deal. We brought Greg in. After hours of pressure and the overwhelming evidence stacking up, he confessed. It wasn't supposed to be fatal, just a threat to scare the victim into paying him back. But things got out of control. The traffic light was what saved this case. If Lisa hadn't panicked and fled the way she did, if the light hadn't glitched just enough to raise suspicion, we might never have uncovered the real killer. It's amazing how sometimes the smallest inconsistency, a light that changes too fast, a car parked a little too long, can peel back the layers of crime and reveal the ugly truth underneath. I still pass that intersection from time to time. And every time I see that light blink from red to green, I remember, in this line of work, nothing is random. You just have to know where to look. I still remember the first time I stepped into that scene. It was a rainy night, the kind that soaks your coat in seconds and makes every street lamp flicker like a dying star. When the call came in, all I knew was that there had been a fatal car crash at the intersection of Willow Creek and 9th. 2 cars, 1 dead. But there was something about the dispatcher's voice, that slight hesitation, that told me this wasn't going to be just another accident. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was a chaos. A black SUV lay crumpled against a telephone pole, its front end completely destroyed. 50 feet away, a silver sedan sat, its side caved in, windshield shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. Emergency crews were everywhere, but it wasn't the crash that caught my attention. It was the traffic lights overhead. They were flashing erratically, not the usual cycle of red, yellow, green, but a strobe-like confusion of signals, almost as if they were malfunctioning on purpose. I approached the wreckage. The driver of the SUV, a middle-aged man named Roger Milton, hadn't survived. The paramedics were covering his body just as I arrived. In the sedan, a young woman was being treated for a concussion, but would live. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. The light was green for me. I swear it was green. At first glance, it looked like another case of someone running a red light. It happens all the time. But something gnawed at me. Years of walking through crime scenes had taught me to listen to that gut feeling. I started by looking at the traffic control box near the intersection. It was a heavy steel cabinet bolted to a concrete slab. Typically, they're locked with key only the city has. This one looked off. As I got closer, I saw the tiny scratch marks around the lock, almost invisible in the rain, but clear under my flashlight. Someone had forced it open. Inside, the board was a mess. Wires had been cut and rearranged. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. They had sabotaged the system to make both directions show green at the same time. An unavoidable collision. But why? I had the traffic control experts come out. They confirmed it. The signals had been deliberately tampered with. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to crash. They had engineered it. Now it wasn't just an accident. It was murder. I needed to find out who had access to that cabinet. According to city records, only a handful of maintenance workers had keys, and none had reported being in the area that night. That narrowed my list, but not enough. Then I got lucky. Reviewing security footage from a nearby gas station, I spotted a blurry figure messing with the control box about an hour before the crash. The rain distorted the image, but the person wore a distinctive bright yellow raincoat, the kind issued by the city's maintenance department. It was a lead, but a dangerous one. If the killer was smart enough to rewire a traffic board and create a lethal accident, they wouldn't go down easily. I ran checks on all the city workers who had access to that box. One name popped up, Samuel Deeks, a former employee, fired 6 months earlier for misconduct, specifically for using his access to city infrastructure for personal gain. When I dug deeper, I found something even more chilling. Roger Milton, the crash victim, had been the supervisor who fired Deeks. Revenge. We tracked Deeks down to a rundown apartment complex on the edge of town. When we kicked in the door, we found more than just Deeks himself. On his kitchen table was a detailed map of city intersections, lists of traffic patterns, and diagrams of light boards. He had been planning something big. Maybe more accidents, maybe worse. In the end, Deeks confessed. In his mind, Milton had ruined his life, and he wanted him to suffer. But he hadn't counted on another car being involved, another life almost lost. Deeks showed no remorse. To him, it was just collateral damage. I left that scene soaked to the bone, exhausted but strangely relieved. We had caught him before he could kill again. But that case stayed with me. It wasn't the complexity of the sabotage or the cold calculation that haunted me. It was how easily it could have worked. One broken box, one careless glance, and death could strike without warning. Sometimes, in this line of work, the killer isn't holding a weapon. Sometimes they just flip a switch and wait. I remember the exact moment I entered that office. The air was thick, almost frozen in time. Papers were scattered across the mahogany desk, drawers left half open, and the faint smell of expensive cologne still lingered in the air. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary ransacking. But I had learned long ago that chaos often disguised something much more deliberate. The victim, Richard Graves, was a well-known financial consultant with more enemies than friends. He was found slumped over his desk, a single bullet wound to the temple, a small pistol, wiped clean of prints, lay neatly on the floor beside his right hand. It was too perfect, and in crime scenes, perfection usually screams deception. I began my examination meticulously, starting with the desk. Amidst the mess, one detail caught my eye immediately. There were 2 pens lying next to each other. One was a cheap ballpoint, the kind you find at any convenience store. The other was an elegant fountain pen, engraved with Richard's initials. Oddly enough, both pens were uncapped, and both were stained. One with blue ink, the other with red. It was subtle enough that anyone without experience might have missed it. But something gnawed at me. Why would someone be using 2 pens at once during what appeared to be a desperate final moment? I leaned closer to the desk. There was a note, short, hurried, as if written under duress. "I'm sorry. I can't live with what I've done." The ink was blue, but when I examined Richard's personal documents strewn across the office, his normal handwriting stood out immediately. He exclusively used red ink. Always had. His colleagues confirmed it later. Richard was obsessive about it, believing that red ink symbolized clarity and control. So why the blue ink for a suicide note? Something wasn't right. I photographed everything carefully. No rushed conclusions. In this line of work, assumptions kill more cases than murderers. I checked the cheap blue pen. It was worn, scratched, almost dead. Likely a pen carried by someone who didn't care much about appearances. The expensive red ink pen, however, looked pristine, unused that day, and had been placed deliberately on top of a pile of folders, as if staged. Instinct told me to dig deeper. I ordered a full forensic sweep, latent fingerprints, ink composition tests, fiber analysis. Every detail could tell a story. And they did. The blue ink didn't match any of Richard's personal or office supplies. Even stranger, the fingerprint on the cheap blue pen didn't match the victim's, but they did match a man named Peter Conway, Richard's former business partner, who had a serious grudge after a messy fallout over embezzlement accusations. Peter claimed he hadn't seen Richard in months, claimed he'd been out of town during the time of death. But the surveillance cameras on the street told another story. A figure matching Peter's description was caught entering the building late that night, just hours before Richard's body was discovered. It was subtle, but the pens had been the key. Without them, we might have accepted the suicide narrative at face value. When confronted, Peter cracked. Under pressure, he admitted he'd come to confront Richard about old grievances. Things escalated. One shoved too hard, and the gun went off. In panic, Peter staged the scene to look like suicide, grabbed a random pen from his pocket to fake the note, never thinking anyone would notice the wrong ink color. But someone did. As I watched him sign his confession, ironically with a blue pen, I couldn't help but think how often criminals outsmart themselves, overlooking the tiniest details. They assume chaos covers their tracks. They don't realize it. To someone who spent nearly 2 decades reading scenes like open books, even 2 forgotten pens can scream the truth louder than a gunshot. And it was those 2 pens, not the gun, not the blood, not the so-called note, that told me everything I needed to know.